I know what you are thinking. Congratulations, Mooney, this is the dumbest video idea ever. You finally hit rock bottom. And maybe I have. Maybe. I mean, how does one even arrive at the question, is Rouge the Bat a Latina? Isn't this an easily answerable question? Can't Wikipedia solve this for us? Well, on the surface, the question seems trivial, and the answer both obvious and incredibly unimportant. But we're not here for a surface-level analysis, we're here to overanalyze, to overthink, and to come away with a bit of understanding in the process. Rouge the Bat is a character in Sonic the Hedgehog, an anthropomorphized bat with a femme fatale demeanor and a penchant for larceny, first introduced in Sonic Adventure 2 back in June of 2001. Times were simpler back then. This is so sad. Maya, play Despacito. Now, Rouge is ostensibly Latin-coded, but her actual ethnicity, if she even has one, is never made clear nor obvious. She never speaks a word of Spanish to my knowledge, and outside of her general appearance, vaguely tropical themes, and some comments by the people who designed her, we have no indication in either direction as to whether Rouge is or isn't a Latina. But there are other ways in which fictional characters can be assigned ethnicities, and some characters have had such a strong sense of ethnicity imposed upon them that what was once fanon becomes canon. As this happened to Rouge, it's complicated, and we'll find out why in just a moment. But first, we must go back to the beginning and understand why any of this even matters. Who cares about Rouge the Bat anyway, and why does her Latina-ness matter in the first place? Well, for me, it all began, you see, with a meme. A meme not about Rouge the Bat, but about Shadow the Hedgehog. Now, before we take our deep dive into the tropical pool of infinite yet unhinged knowledge, before I make a mountain out of a hedgehog hill, I need to ask, have you had your vitamins today? How about your vegetables? You know what Sonic the Hedgehog always says, the occasional chili dog is nice, but
the old body needs some fruit and vegetables now and then.
And if you are lacking in either, then maybe you ought to try this video's sponsor, Groens. Groens, and yes, I'm pronouncing the umlaut every time, are a convenient, comprehensive formula packed into 8 gummies a day. It is no mere multivitamin, no mere greens gummy, no mere probiotic. It is all of these things put together and then some, but for a fraction of the price. And, as a plus, it tastes like a healthy, yummy fruit snack. A regular old multivitamin contains 7 to 9 vitamins and minerals, but Groens have over 20 V's and M's in addition to more than 60 different whole food ingredients that have known health benefits. Groens are vegan too and come in a sugar-free variety, meaning they're good for all kinds of peoples and diets. Let's take a look at the label together. You see here how all of the vitamins and minerals are carefully balanced? There is no laziness here. You get your daily supply and you don't pay for extra that you'll end up excreting or worse, end up accidentally overdosing on. I've been eating my Groens for almost a month now and I have to say, I enjoy them. I've personally had some trouble with folate absorption in the past and I like that Groens are more bioavailable by design. Groens are methylated, allowing for easier absorption of key nutrients like vitamin B12 and folate. Look, it's as Sonic says,
you need premium fuel to run your best.
And you can get that fuel with Groens. It's more than just the bare necessities, it's Groens. I wrote that slogan myself, by the way, pretty good, right? Try Groens today by clicking on the link in the description or in the pinned comment and get up to 45% off your order. Once again, that's 45% off your Groens order using my link below. A special thanks to Groens for sponsoring this video. So there's this meme that's been haunting my consciousness lately. It was shared with me by one of you actually out of the blue one day, and as someone who is both an outsider to social media and not very well versed in internet culture, I was stunned. I was shocked by what I saw. I'm going to play the meme for you in full and narrate it as we go along so that you can experience this meme as I did. I'm going to presume you know nothing about Sonic the Hedgehog, which knowing my audience isn't very likely, but nevertheless, here we go.
Give me back my passport!
These are 2 characters from the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. On the right is the eponymous anthropomorphic Sonic the Hedgehog, the primary protagonist of the series. His special power is running very quickly. And to the left is Shadow the Hedgehog, a brooding anti-hero made in a laboratory through genetic experimentation by Professor Gerald Robotnik, who just so happens to be the grandfather of Sonic's nemesis, Dr. Ivo Eggman Robotnik. The professor made Shadow in an attempt to cure his granddaughter Maria's mysterious and life-threatening illness by creating the perfect life form. So, pretty straightforward thus far. Let's continue.
Why do you want to go to Mexico?
This little snippet here offers us 3 different insights. The first is that Shadow wants to go to Mexico. The second is that Sonic the Hedgehog is an American citizen with an American passport. And the third is that Shadow the Hedgehog either isn't an American citizen or is an American citizen but hasn't gotten his passport yet, both of which explain why he has stolen Sonic's. If he isn't an American citizen, then he is either a citizen of a country like Serbia, which doesn't have visa-free travel to Mexico, which means he cannot use his passport to immediately travel to Mexico without first acquiring said visa, or he doesn't have a passport from any foreign country, which is a possibility because Shadow was made in a laboratory in space.
Space!
Oh, that's right, I forgot to mention the genetic engineering lab was in space, on a space station, shaped like a face. Look. Don't worry about it. Now, if Shadow is an American citizen but still resorted to stealing Sonic's passport, we can determine that his need for the passport was likely urgent or desperate. Otherwise, he'd apply for his own. So why does Shadow want to go to Mexico? Let's continue.
I just love Latinas, Sonic.
What?
Shadow wants to go to Mexico because he just loves Latinas, Sonic. He loves them so much that he urgently needs to travel to Mexico and is willing to commit identity and immigration fraud to do so. Finally, the meme concludes, and we learn here that Shadow knows at least 2 words in Spanish.
Adios, amigo.
I could do naught but stare in shock thereafter, perplexed by what I'd seen. You may be asking, Mooney, how does Rouge the Bat get involved in any of this? Well, to answer that, we need to talk about parallel universes. Yes, I've made that joke before, but I couldn't help myself. In any case, there's a popular fanship, short for relationship, in the Sonic fandom that romantically entangles Shadow the Hedgehog with Rouge the Bat, a character from Sonic Adventure 2, which is the game where both characters made their debut. They're both anti-heroes who have a love-hate relationship with Sonic. They've interacted before as members of the same villainous team. They both have a sort of chip on their shoulder, cooler-than-thou attitude. And, well, Shadow loves Latinas, Sonic. So if Shadow loves Rouge, then Rouge must be a Latina, right? I'm afraid the answer is more complicated than it seems, so let's break down this bad romance as the lawyer do, and begin with a simple, hypothetical question. Now obviously as a meme, what we watch together is all fanon, non-canon. Nevertheless, if we presume that all of the mimetic material above is indeed true to the overarching fan perception of Shadow the Hedgehog, we are left with but one question. And that question is Shadow the Hedgehog Serbian? What do you think? Come up with an answer on your own, okay? No cheating. Alright, time's up. If you're a sane person, which again, knowing my audience, isn't very likely, the answer you came up with was hopefully no. Probably not. But why? Why isn't Shadow the Hedgehog Serbian? Well, you might say Shadow was born in space and thus has no birthright citizenship. But Serbia doesn't have birthright citizenship by place of birth, or jus soli. Serbia is a jus sanguinis state, right of blood, meaning one can only become a Serbian citizen by acquiring citizenship at birth, by naturalization, or by descent of one's parents as per Article 23 of the 2004 Citizenship Act. Shadow could also be a Serbian citizen if he was a citizen of Montenegro living in Serbia and applied for citizenship within the 5-year period after the Montenegrin independence referendum of 2006, but we are getting ahead of ourselves here. Shadow, as a perfect life form, could very well be a Serbian citizen if any of his genetics come from any Serbian citizen parent. If Shadow is like Cell from Dragon Ball Z and has genetics taken from every life form and potentially every iteration of every life form, then both Shadow and Cell could be Serbian citizens. But only if the genetic parent is a woman and that parent went out of her way to enter Shadow's name into the Register of Births when he came out of his test tube thing. Which seems unlikely. Or if she and Shadow thereafter sought a final court judgment on the matter, which is plausible but mere conjecture given what we have as evidence. Which is to say, the answer on paper, the responsible answer is, it depends, which I know is very lawyerly of me. But the obvious real answer is, well, of course not. Of course, Shadow the Hedgehog isn't Serbian because what characteristics of a Serb does Shadow the Hedgehog exhibit exactly? There's this arbitrary paper trail, sure, but by that metric, Shadow could just as easily be Nigerian or Chinese. How do we determine what is and isn't Serbian? What does that even mean? and who gets to decide what that means? If we call something or someone Serbian who isn't outright and obviously Serbian, aren't we just projecting a bunch of stereotypes onto that thing or person? Well, instead of answering any of that, I'm going to offer a follow-up question for all the Sonic fans in the audience. Here we go. Is Knuckles black? And heck, since we already threw Dragon Ball Z into the mix in questioning whether Cell was Serbian, let me ask you this also. Is Piccolo black? I'll give you 3 seconds to think up an answer. This time I bet a lot of you answered yes to both. Why? Overlooking the fact that black is an ethnicity and Serbian is a nationality for a moment, what makes Knuckles or Piccolo black when Shadow and Cell aren't Serbian? As we discussed, Shadow and Cell don't really have any traits that are especially or particularly Serbian. The artists never intended to write Shadow or Cell as Serbian, and there hasn't been an adoption of Shadow or Cell as Serbs by the Serbian community to my knowledge. No association by stereotype, no artistic intent, and no community adoption. In other words, Shadow and Cell are not coded as Serbian. But for Knuckles and Piccolo, well, one could argue that there are physical characteristics that code these characters as black. For Knuckles, he has spines that give the appearance of dreadlocks, a culturally significant black hairstyle. Knuckles has a strong, grounded personality, a bruiser build, and a deep, resonant voice, which are characteristics that are seen as relatable and aspirational to many black young men. Piccolo has differently colored skin from the main cast, and he also has a deep, resonant voice. He wears a turban and cape, giving something of a Moorish or North African appearance. There are physical design choices that are enough to give an observer the impression that the characters could be black, regardless of what the characters' designers intended. Which is to say, there are stereotypes that are often associated with black people that can also be projected onto Knuckles or Piccolo. But there's also artistic intent. For example, we've recently seen Sega lean heavily into the idea that Knuckles is black. In the recent Sonic movies, Knuckles is portrayed by Idris Elba, a black actor. In the Sonic Adventure games, Knuckles' soundtrack is exclusively hip-hop, a black genre of music with its roots in black culture. Knuckles is also portrayed as an outsider, different in nature and experiences from the other anthropomorphized animal creatures. He's a bit of a loner. He's often othered for his differences in behavior and perception. He guards a massive emerald of incredible worth, literally the heart of his people's culture, from thieves who would steal it for their own nefarious purposes. You could probably write a whole video essay on just that topic alone. If you do, link it to me and I'll put it up on my YouTube community page. I think that'd be a fascinating essay. In any case, it's easy to see then that the black coating of Knuckles might have been intentional from the outset, and indeed is almost irrefutably intentional now. With Piccolo, we don't have as much metatextual evidence in support of his blackness, and yet we see that Piccolo, like Knuckles, has a story that revolves around his othering. His experiences, his demeanor, his perceptions, and even his appearance are quite different from the Saiyans and the people around him. He overcomes that othering to be an essential part of the Z-Squad, going so far as to even be a father figure to the young Saiyan Gohan. It's a story that mirrors the experiences of many black people. As such, it is easy to see why many young black men took to Piccolo or Knuckles as black characters. In the late 90s and early 2000s, relatable black characters in video games were quite rare, as video game directors and character designers weren't often themselves black and had very little interaction with black people, particularly in the case of Japanese devs. This attribution of racial characteristics to fictional characters, intentional or otherwise, is called race coding. If you're interested in the blackness of Piccolo, by the way, there's an excellent book on this topic by Jordan Calhoun called literally Piccolo is Black, a memoir of race, religion, and pop culture. It's all about how media shapes our identities, and it makes a great supplement to this video. Moving back to the topic of Knuckles, though, we are given other indications in his design that suggest that Knuckles isn't black. His tribe, the Echidnas, are heavily Maya-coded, for example. But I don't think that takes away from Knuckles' blackness necessarily. Knuckles is a fictional character. Anthropomorphic talking echidnas are a fictional species, and Angel Island is a fictional place. And in fiction, a culture can be black and Mayan. If Knuckles has black characteristics, is intended to be black in some capacity by those in charge of his character design, and has been adopted by the black community as black, then he is black. And so is Piccolo. Maybe Vegeta is a Latino. Fun fact, Shadow's voice actor in the movie Sonic the Hedgehog 3 is the same actor who portrays Vegeta in the Spanish-language DBZ dub. So maybe Shadow was actually Latino, which changes his attraction to Latinas from surprising to expected. Goku is apparently every ethnicity and nationality under the sun. Lately he's been especially Mexican, but that could change, who can say? And yet the question remains, what about Rouge the Bat? Is Rouge the Bat Latina? Every time I make a video, someone who read the title but didn't watch the video and thinks they're being really clever will leave a comment with the obvious but wrong answer. As we figure out the race-coding labyrinth of Rouge the Bat, we must first wade through the shallow kindergarten material that appears in these comments. At the surface level, Rouge is strongly Latina-coded. She's ostensibly a Honduran fruit bat. Her musical tracks are all rather tropical and Latin-sounding. Takashi Iizuka, one of the creative minds behind Rouge, is on record stating that he was inspired by Latin American women while designing Rouge. Already, that's pretty compelling evidence that Rouge was intended to be a Latina. As an aside, why are so many Japanese bat creature things inspired by specifically the Honduran white bat? Rouge, of course, is based on the Honduran white bat, but so is the Pokemon Woobat. There's Paolumu from Monster Hunter. There's even a Honduran white bat character in Kimono Friends, who despite the Honduran white bat's utter obscurity, takes up a spot amongst other bat giants like the brown long-eared bat or the vampire bat, and native Japanese bats like the Hilgendorf's tube-nosed bat and the Daito fruit bat. In fact, the Honduran white bat is the only non-European, non-Japanese bat in the entire Kimono Friends roster. Is this just perception bias? Why is Japan so obsessed with the Honduran white bat? I even checked the list of animals at the Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka zoos. There is no Honduran white bat. Why the obsession with this obscure flying mammal? Well, to understand that, we have to start with the opening of Japan by Matthew Perry. Sorry, what was this video about again? Oh right, Rouge the Bat. Well, on the surface, Rouge is heavily Latina-coded vis-a-vis artistic intent. There's plenty of surface evidence to suggest that Rouge is Latina, but herein lies the complication. Can a character who is not outright stated as being Latina and yet is coded as Latina by the design of her creators actually be Latina without her adoption by the Latina community at large? In other words, who is the arbiter of who is and isn't a Latina? For our Serbian example, Serbian is a nationality. The government of Serbia decides through laws who is and isn't Serbian. But Latina is an ethnicity. There is no governing body that decides who is and isn't Latina. You decide for yourself based on your experiences whether you are or aren't Latina, and other Latinas can corroborate and verify your Latinaness relative to their own Latinaness. Or they can reject your Latinaness if your experiences of being a Latina do not correspond to their own. And for some people, that rejection might not change their self-perception as a Latina. Consider the case of Rachel Dolezal, who was born to white parents of primarily German, Czech, and Swedish origin, but who self-identifies and presents as black. The black community at large rejects her claims to blackness because she comes from a completely white background with only white life experiences, and has put on a mask of blackness built from stereotypes and out of the stated experiences of others that she herself has never lived through. Ethnicity is nebulous in this way. The goalposts aren't planted in any one place. Is Rachel Dolezal black? Most, if not all, would say no, she's not. Is Drake black? Opinion on that has changed very recently, and the conclusion from the wider black community seems to be increasingly that he is not, in fact, like us. Let's look at another example. The definition of white as defined by white people has moved around quite a few times in the last 100 years. For example, the Irish, ostensibly by color palette the whitest of all peoples on God's green earth, were considered of dubious whiteness in the 19th century United States. Italians were considered unwhite even as late as the 1920s because Italians, quote-unquote, did not act white. East Asians have been declared not white by the US federal courts not once, not twice, but 13 separate times. Ironically, perhaps given present-day circumstances, the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas held that Mexicans are white way back in 1897, though the overarching white population seems to have changed their mind at some point since then. Which is to say, there have been many attempts at legally codifying whiteness as a means of excluding everyone else from the tangible benefits of whiteness. And yet, consider this. In 1909, the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York held that a person who is half white, 1/4 Japanese, and 1/4 Chinese is not white. But let's say hypothetically that a half-white, half-East Asian person grew up in the United States, only interacted with white people, was raised exclusively by their white parent, never met their Asian parent or was even told that they had an Asian parent, and was indistinguishable in appearance from any other white person. Is that person white? If a tree falls in a forest, but nobody is around to hear it, does it make a sound? If a half-white, half-Asian is born in Mississippi, but nobody is around to racially profile it, does it become a minority? The law here has limits because ethnicity, unlike nationality generally, is a product of self-identification, which is then validated and recognized by the ethnic group one self-identifies as. So here's my definition. A Latina is someone who considers themselves a Latina, and who the average, reasonable Latina, or the Latina ethnic group at large, would recognize as a Latina. Which means, of course, that it is possible for one's Latinaness, one's ethnicity, to be clear from a self-identification level like Rachel Dolezal and blackness, but muddy from the perspective of the group. And yet, as long as one considers oneself black or Latina, there is at least one single person validating your claim to that ethnicity. And if you remain in those convictions, you are black or Latina. Again, maybe only to you, but nobody can take that away from you because ethnicity is a fluid, moving construct. Kendrick Lamar and a growing number of black people might consider Drake a colonizer and thereby not black. But DJ Academics probably believes differently. Let's look at another example, but more relevant to the topic of Latinas. Here it comes. Are Brazilians Latina? Portuguese is a Romance language with its roots in Latin, and Brazil shares many cultural similarities with its South American neighbors. Yet, and this may come as a surprise to many Brazilians, if you ask other Latin Americans, are Brazilians Latino or Latina, many of them will say no. Because in their mind, Latina is an experience of life and heritage that is unified by the Spanish language and cultural background, which is to them dissimilar to the Brazilian Portuguese experience of life. The cultural identity of being Hispanic in their minds is tied to being a Latina, and Hispanicness cannot be separated from Latinaness. To them, the etymology, the context of the word Latina, is less important than the shared experiences that they've lived, and that other Latinas have lived throughout Latin America, which necessarily includes the Spanish language and the legacy of Spanish colonialism. In fact, on the US Census, if you are Brazilian and state as much but check off Latino or Latina as your ethnicity, the US Census Bureau will reclassify you as non-Latino/Latino. And this happens because the U.S. Office of Management and Budget, in the 1997 revision of Statistical Policy Directive No. 15, defines Latino/Latina as applying only to those of Spanish culture or origin. To the U.S. Census, Hispanic equals Latino/Latina. But to many ordinary Latinos and Latinas, I mean, who cares? Of course the Brazilians are Latin, and there's tons of cultural cross-pollination throughout Latin America anyhow. The Brazilians have more in common with us than the Argentinians, they say, and the Argentinians speak Spanish, right? So who cares? And that's a fair question. Ethnicity is in the eye of the beholder. So here's what we've arrived at, in the most annoyingly overcomplicated and lawyerly way possible. Number 1. Fictional characters can be imbued with unspoken ethnic characteristics by artists via artistic intent. Number 2. Fictional characters can be adopted by ethnic communities due to their race coding, which in turn lends validity to the notion that said characters are of that ethnicity. Number 3. Ethnicity is self-defined and community-validated, which means if a character doesn't have a defined ethnicity, then an ethnicity can be projected onto said character, which said character cannot reject, because the character is fictional and has no agency. But we're missing a crucial piece of the puzzle here, and as such we aren't quite ready to determine whether or not Rouge is a Latina. For you see, though there was some artistic intent to portray Rouge as Latina, and though Rouge is popularly shipped with Shadow who loves Latinas, and though Rouge has a vaguely Latina appearance and vaguely Latin-sounding background music, these are ethnic traits that have been projected onto Rouge generally by non-Latinas. Which is to say, by and large, Rouge hasn't been adopted by the larger Latina community in a meaningful capacity. Certainly not in the way that Knuckles has been for many American blacks, Goku has been for many Mexicans, or Saint Seiya has for many Brazilians. If you are a Latina who strongly identifies with Rouge, let me know in the comments. I'm genuinely curious. And that brings us to the last hypothetical I have for you, before we finally break down Rouge's ethnicity in full. My final question to you then is this. Is Ugandan Knuckles black? On March 6, 2017, animator and artist Greg Zilla produced a short animation wherein a highly stylized caricature of Knuckles sings "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire" by the Ink Spots. This portrayal was entirely innocent and inoffensive. It was almost a throwaway clip meant just to showcase a funny joke. Unfortunately for Greg Zilla, his portrayal of Knuckles was indeed about to set the world on fire. A year prior, on August 7, 2016, a YouTuber named Virtually Vain, whose shtick is pretending to be an African warlord, accent and all, uploads a video to YouTube in which he plays Call of Duty Black Ops while pretending to be, well, an African warlord. In this particular video, he runs around on voice chat declaring to his teammates, "Follow me, I know the way." His teammates, startled by the voice and accent, play along, following Vain to comedic effect. This kind of edgy, rather insensitive humor surrounding African warlords was quite popular at the time, I think due to the failure of Coney 2012 just a few years prior, but heavily exacerbated by Vain's success on YouTube. Other content creators inspired by Vain tried to borrow some of his edgy humor, some of which persists to this very day, completely devoid of its context.
People, Seth here.
Content creators like Seth and even the Twitch streamer Forsen participated in this edgy humor, with Uganda in particular being a popular country and accent to poke fun at. But our story does not end there. On September 15, 2017, deviant artist Tidiest Flyer rather innocently releases a 3D model based on Greg Zilla's silly Knuckles caricature. And then, on December 22, 2017, a now defunct YouTuber who goes by Stalsby uploads a video titled "You Do Not Know the Way," in which a swarm of VR chat players use Tidiest Flyer's 3D model, combine it with Virtually Vain's catchphrase from the 2016 Black Ops video, and run around harassing people and generally being a nuisance. They'd run up to a VR chat player minding their own business and ask, "Do you know the way?" And when the VR chat player answers back confused, they declare that said player does not, in fact, know the way, and then chase said player around while angrily yelling that said player does not know the way, while also clicking their tongues in a parody of presumably Zulu or Xhosa, those languages being the most well-known click languages. Now, Zulu and Xhosa are both in the Bantu language family. Uganda does have a substantial population of Bantu speakers, but Bantu is a language family of over 600 languages and has an enormous geographic range that covers like a third of the African continent. Notably, the Bantu languages spoken in Uganda don't utilize clicks, and even then, the official language of Uganda is, well, English. But I digress. It's not like the creators of Ugandan Knuckles cared one iota about any of this stuff, which as we will see is precisely the problem. Ugandan Knuckles became a gigantic meme. It was everywhere. It was like Skibbity Toilet for Gen Z. On December 23, 2017, YouTuber Sawyer Cake publishes another Ugandan Knuckles video that goes viral. Then on December 28th, Tanks Blast uploads a Ugandan Knuckles video. More and more videos come out and go viral. On January 1st, Searmore uploads a Ugandan Knuckles video. On January 3rd of 2018, Tank Blast's video gets posted on Reddit. On January 5th, E-Bombs Worlds publishes an article on the growing meme. On January 27th, 2018, Razer, who's going to blacklist me for sponsorships after this video, put out a tone-deaf marketing tweet referencing the meme, and so on and so forth. Like all memes though, at some point, Ugandan Knuckles became overdone and increasingly unfunny. It lost its edge, and presumably its fan base graduated from middle school and outgrew the humor along the way. The meme saw a brief resurgence in December of 2021 with the announcement that Idris Elba would be voicing Knuckles in the second Sonic the Hedgehog movie. But the resurgence was largely ironic, more about poking fun at the dead meme than celebrating it. Ugandan Knuckles presents us with a strange set of facts. This is a character who was designed to be black, is heavily black-coded, but is coded in such a way that is meant to be racist. What separates a Japanese game developer portraying every Brazilian as a shirtless capoeira fighting charmer, or Barrett Wallace from Final Fantasy VII as Mr. T from Ugandan Knuckles? Why are these two considered just a little racist, but ultimately both harmless and easy to culturally adopt, when Ugandan Knuckles is widely seen as seriously racist and dehumanizing? Well, Capoeira Brazilians and Barrett Wallace come from a place ultimately of good intentions, and these characters are meant to be related to and loved. Ugandan Knuckles comes from a place of malicious intent. He is a character meant to troll, and he is designed to be hated by his victims. As an aside, a lot of American punditry just doesn't understand this point. Why do Mexicans love Speedy Gonzales despite Speedy being an American caricature of a Mexican? Why do Brazilians love Blanca despite Blanca being a portrayal of Brazilians as jungle creatures who can conduct electricity? It's because these portrayals have good intentions and depth and can still be adopted by these cultural groups who don't commonly have representation in popular media otherwise. The link between stereotype and archetype, between stereotype and trope is very thin, and I think if one is well-intentioned and reasonably informed, one shouldn't be afraid to make art that may accidentally cross over the line into stereotype, nor be assassinated for any errors that arise. A gentle correction is more than enough guidance for a well-intentioned creator. You could end up creating the next Speedy Gonzales or the next Knuckles. What you don't want to do, though, is make the next Ugandan Knuckles. But I digress. If a fictional character is black-coded with authorial intent, but is not accepted by the black community as being an acceptable portrayal of blackness, is this character black? The audience for this character is primarily white people who find this kind of thing funny. This white audience then recognizes Ugandan Knuckles as black. The question then arises, can ethnicity be unilaterally imposed on a character without the consent of that ethnicity? This brings us to some uncomfortable places, doesn't it? Is Jim Crow in Dumbo black? He's intended to be black, he's seen as black by the white audience he was written for, but his name and portrayal comes from a black-faced minstrel character called Jim Crow. A character so infamous for negatively portraying black people that it lent its name to the Jim Crow laws, which enforced racial segregation in the American South. And the last of these laws were overturned as late as 1965. And yet, if you look up any video of Jim Crow in Dumbo, you'll see comments upset at how anyone could think that this is racist. Folks, this character was designed with racism as a point of pride. If you can't see racism in literally Jim Crow, is there anywhere that you can see it? Ugandan Knuckles isn't that dissimilar to Jim Crow. UK just has a better veneer of plausible deniability. And thus I'd argue that neither Ugandan Knuckles nor Jim Crow are black. They are caricatures of what a white person thinks a black person is, but exaggerated in a negative way so as to make the character's parodied background the butt of the joke. UK is a creation of white minds for the consumption of largely white people. No blackness is involved. Therefore, Ugandan Knuckles and Jim Crow are blackface. They're minstrels. White racist humor posing as blackness. And this takeaway, that there is in fact some line where a character's race coding can cross from being well-intentioned to blackface, is the final piece of the puzzle that we need to finally understand Rouge the Bat. We've barreled through a lot of context, and so before we get to our final analysis, let's review all that we've learned and see where the lines are drawn. Starting with number 1, ethnicity is self-identified, but number 2, ethnicity is community validated, and as such, one's self-identity can be disenfranchised by other members of that ethnic group. In other words, your card can be revoked by the proper authorities. Number 3, a fictional character's ethnicity is in the eye of the beholder and subjective. Ethnicity by nature is fluid, and thus a character that is black to one person could be Asian to another and Latino to yet another, and they can all be right. Number 4, however, because ethnicity is community validated, if the ethnic identity projected onto said character is rejected by the ethnic community it purports to represent, then that representation lacks validity. The fictional character's card can also be revoked. Number 5. Yet there can also be a situation where a character's ethnicity is rejected by that ethnic group and also comes completely from the minds and bad intentions of a different ethnic group. In those situations, the character can generally be understood as possessing the ethnicity of the original bad faith creators. Blackface isn't black, it's white, and the same applies to fictional portrayals. Number 6. Authorial intent can shed clarity on all of the above, but if a character's ethnicity is not outright stated, authorial intent is not the final arbiter. Which brings us to number 7. As such, to determine a character's ethnicity, one must weigh authorial intent against community validation viewed through the lens of personal subjectivity. I know what you're thinking. This metric is useless if ultimately the formula must be run through everyone's personal biases. Ugandan Knuckles would always be black then to a racist, even if everyone else agrees that he isn't. If one's personal biases are strong enough, the personal subjectivity factor will overwhelm the other two metrics of the test, won't it? Well, yes, that's the point. The results will ultimately differ from person to person, but that's unavoidable given the fluid nature of ethnicity. Nothing appears racist to the racist. And really, you don't even have to be a racist. If you ship Shadow super hard with, gosh, I don't know, Princess Zelda, Shelda, we'll call it. Wait, does that mean that shipping Shadow with Maria is Sharia? With my sincerest apologies to my beloved Muslim viewers, if you ship Shelda or Sharia and you're really into that, then it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks, and from what I've gathered from Pearly and bits and pieces over the years, this obstinacy is a pretty common phenomenon amongst shippers. That said, if one is a reasonable person with a reasonable lens, then the subjectivity element won't necessarily imbalance the final result. The X factor exists because some people have very strong feelings about anthropomorphic bats. Given all that we've discussed then, let's take our formula, our rule, and apply it to the facts in a way that a lawyer might. Let's start with authorial intent. We alluded earlier to the fact that Rouge's designers took some inspiration from Latinas when it came to designing her. In a now archived interview on SonicTeam.com, Takashi Iizuka, the director and lead designer of Sonic Adventure 2, the first game where Rouge appears, states the following regarding Rouge's Latina inspiration, and I quote, "I decided to create a slightly sexy character that hadn't been in the series before, but since it's a deformed character, it took a lot of trial and error, adding and subtracting sexiness. The costume also needed to be neither too eccentric nor too ordinary. As a result, Jennifer Lopez is famous in Japan, and I thought I'd borrow a bit of the sexiness of Latin women, which became the inspiration for the final draft. Her skin is brown. She has the same abilities as Knuckles, but we differentiated her by making her actions elegant and focusing on kicking techniques." Kicking techniques, you say? Well, okay. So Rouge borrows inspiration from J-Lo and the quote-unquote sexiness of Latin women. Her skin is specifically noted as being brown, presumably because she's Latina. She's also ostensibly a Honduran white bat, which has a range that spans from eastern Honduras to western Panama. Or is she? This is going to be a controversial take, but I actually don't agree that Rouge is based on the Honduran white bat, and I think the kicking techniques is a dead giveaway. For you see, Japan has very little exposure to Latin American culture, and thus Japanese portrayals of Latin America tend to be a stereotypical, exaggerated mishmash. Consider Samba de Amigo or Samba de Amigo, which features a Mexican monkey wearing a sombrero and playing maracas, to Brazilian samba with the aesthetics of carnival, which is also Brazilian. I have a whole video on why Japan loves Brazil. It might be worth a watch. My point is this: if you're a Japanese dev in the late 90s who wants to make a sexy Latina-esque character, you draw from what you know. And what you know is Jennifer Lopez and Brazil. That's right, I'm going to argue that Rouge the Bat is not a Honduran white bat, but it's actually a northern ghost bat. A bat with a range that spans from southern Mexico to as far south as Sao Paulo. Take a look at the Honduran white bat. Does this thing look like Rouge? Would you design a sexy character based on this bat with the oogie boogie shaped nose? I think not. The northern ghost bat, on the other hand, has very simple, unexaggerated features, a perfect canvas. But outside of vibes, look also at the ears. The Honduran white bat has translucent ears that are tapered to a point and have no fur on them. Moon Channel artist Larita Shine also notes the very distinctive yellow coloration of the Honduran white bat, a feature the northern ghost bat lacks. But now let's look at Rouge. Her ears come up and round off a bit. They do not taper to a point. They're also opaque, and most importantly, the back of the ears are covered in fur and are white. This isn't consistent with the Honduran white bat, but is consistent with the northern ghost bat. The Rita Shine also argues that Paolumu could be northern ghost bat inspired given the shape of its head and ears, but that's outside of the scope of this video. Back to Rouge, there's another tell here. Her primary means of fighting is kicking. Like, I don't know, capoeira, maybe? The single fighting style that every Latin American character in every Japanese fighting game ever fights in? My point is this, there's absolutely an artistic intent here that ties Rouge objectively to Jennifer Lopez and Latinas as a whole. But there is also some subtext here which ties Rouge's character design specifically to Brazil. My proposition then is that Rouge might be Brazilian, and that complicates the artistic intent factor a little bit. Further complicating the artistic intent is Rouge's name, a name that is very evidently French. I have a personal theory about this if you care to hear it. Sonic Adventure 1 was developed by Sonic Team in Japan and released in December of 1998. However, in 1999, many members of Sonic Team Japan, including Takashi Iizuka and Yuji Naka, moved to the United States, specifically to San Francisco, to develop the Western localization. When Sonic Adventure proved successful, Sega requested a sequel, and the team, still based in SF, developed Sonic Adventure 2, where Rouge makes her first appearance. Given the team's exposure to America then, I believe there is a good chance that Rouge gets her name from, well, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. She is a bat named Rouge. Baton Rouge. Why did they pick this name when Rouge is based on Latinas? It's because they didn't know any better. That's my theory, at least. We'll return to this later, but for now let's move on to community adoption. Is Rouge a beloved character amongst Latinas? Have Latinas adopted her in any meaningful capacity as their own? I mean, maybe? If they have, they've been awfully quiet about it. Folks were swinging from the rafters when Idris Elba was announced as the voice of Knuckles. If J-Lo gets picked up to voice Rouge, are the Latinas going to be blowing up, I don't know, what do people use nowadays? Tumblr? Some will, surely, but even amongst the Latina nerddom, I'd imagine, probably not. Which begs the question we asked earlier. Can a character who is not explicitly written as a Latina, but is merely Latina coded by artist intention, be considered a Latina if the only verification of her Latinaness comes from non-Latinas? Is this case more like Knuckles or Ugandan Knuckles? There is non-malicious artistic intent here. Can one argue that the mishmash of Louisiana, J-Lo, and Brazil makes for a perhaps slightly ignorant take on character design? Sure, I mean, you know, it was the 90s. Cultural ignorance was commonplace back then. But ignorance is not the same thing as malice. Not knowing isn't the same as actively hurting. And one should never presume malice where an explanation of ignorance will suffice. There's a big difference, and I often see the two mixed up. The intention was to create a cool character for the anti-hero team, and I think Iizuka and the gang succeeded. In this way, Rouge is not like Ugandan Knuckles, who was made with malicious intent, an intent to use a stereotypical racial persona to troll. As such, Rouge lies somewhere in between Ugandan Knuckles and Knuckles. Her validation as a Latina comes largely from non-Latina fans, who either find shipping her with a Latina-loving shadow funny, or buy into the stated artistic intent. In a balancing test then, given the rather glaring artistic intention for Rouge to be a Latina, we can conclude that Rouge the Bat is more likely than not a Latina. And hey, maybe after this video the Brazilians will adopt her and she'll be a community-verified Latina as well. But wait, are Brazilians Latinas? Remember what we discussed earlier? What if Spanish-speaking Latinas reject Brazilians as Latina and thereby by proxy automatically reject Rouge as Latina? Wouldn't this shift the balance in the test considerably? Yes, but ethnicity is subjective. That's why the subjective lens is the final arbiter of the formula. If Brazilians consider themselves Latinas, then they are. Goku can be Mexican, Knuckles can be black, and Rouge can be Latina. Thus, I leave you with the most annoyingly lawyerly answer to the question that I could possibly provide. Is Rouge the Bat a Latina? Well, it depends. But yeah, I'd say probably. More likely than not. Yes. Being a lawyer does something to your brain. It creates in one an insatiable desire to dig into the meat and bones of things. But it can also cause one to overthink to an extreme and sometimes hilarious degree. Pearly and Maya have had to put up with my ranting for years and years. Now I get to make all of you suffer, much to their relief. I recognize that ultimately, is Rouge the Bat a Latina is a totally unimportant question that nobody really cares about the answer to. But it is fun and interesting nevertheless to dig into the topic and really ponder out the answer. To experience the journey of discovery and curiosity even when the destination is as eye-rollingly bland as maybe. While puzzling this question out, we considered the intricacies of ethnicity together. We looked at some case studies and put together a framework. Was it the most robust framework ever? Maybe not, but that's also a part of learning. And I can read your comments to see what does or doesn't make sense to you and see myself what I can learn. I hope then that you enjoyed this deeply silly but passionately made video. It's not my longest work nor my most scholarly work, but I pray that this little exploration and celebration of ethnicity can bring you comfort in what many might consider anxious times. The soundtrack in this video is in the description for you along with a few other songs I couldn't find the space for. So please, enjoy. I've been your host, Mooney. Moon Channel donates 10% of its income to charity, so I appreciate your patience with our sponsors. Thank you to Groons for sponsoring this video. Thank you also to Moon Channel's generous and dearly beloved patrons who make all of this possible. To Larita Shine for art, to Mint Lamb for script review, to Silva Gunner and Timmy Turner's granddad for the music. And last but never least, thank you for tuning in to Moon Channel.
The Latins are up now. Why don't we all take an escucha to their pick?
We, the Latinos, choose.
Rouge the Bat.
I don't understand that one.
We wanted to do this before the white people tried to adopt him as one of their own. Again.
Antes de meterlo, soy un super cerdo que se importa, no se importan jugando a la Nintendo. Vengo dando saltos de alegría, derribando muros, saliendo de apuros.